great to see you again. And as I said, I hope you all had a good break. I'm conscious people are trickling in, so we might find the first few minutes more people arrive. Um, and I know it's been a bit of a hectic one for everyone with CTK and with all the ICT issues that have happened. So we're just really grateful that you've taken the time to come here. It's a really great turnout for one of these sessions. And we've been, I suppose, grateful for the participation during the year. So Susan and Andy are here, and they're going to be talking about taking boys seriously. I know some schools have already done some work with you in the past and with the program, and some are coming into this very fresh and new. So we're all really excited to hear what you have to say. And just whenever you're ready to get started, off you go.
Okay. Tina, thanks very much for the introductions, and hello everybody. Thanks for joining Andy and myself online today to talk about the Taking Boys Seriously research. My name is Susan Morgan. I am a community youth work lecturer in Ulster University. I've been working here for over 20 years, really teaching informal education. Before that, I was a youth worker. And I have also been the principal investigator of a piece of research called Taking Boys Seriously. This current iteration of that research has been ongoing since 2018, and there was a prior research that was published in 2011, was it? 2012? 2012, of Taking Boys Seriously too. So it's been a very long-term piece of research, and we are going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour of it today. We'll take you on a journey through what we've done in the research, and also some of the tools that we've developed in respect of that. Do you want to introduce yourself, Andy?
Yeah, nice to meet everyone. I also have a background in youth work, and I've been working with Susan on the Taking Boys Seriously project since 2021. And I'm currently lecturing on the community youth work degree program here at Ulster University.
So, as Tiernan said, some of you may have come across our work before, and some of you may have participated in the research already as well. And if not, today will give you a good feel for what it's been about anyway. And there's opportunities always to still engage with us. Whilst we're finished the active research part of Taking Boys Seriously, we are in a phase of impact and how we can be more impactful in relation to the evidence that was generated through the research. So we'll talk a little bit more as we go through about how you might, if you are interested, get involved in using the research in your practice. But we like to start at the end. We begin at the end, and what you're going to see here in front of you is what we call the Boys and Young Men's Quadrant. And so the Boys and Young Men's Quadrant is an evidence-based tool that's evolved from the TBS research as we moved that evolution from TBS, from research to impact. Our intention in Taking Boys Seriously has always been to do something rather than to say something. And the quadrant is designed to focus on 5 particular areas under that broader idea, broader concept of empowerment. So the 5 areas that the quadrant focuses on are voice and belonging, influence, interdependence, and identity. It's a 4-stage process whereby educators collaborate with boys and each other to examine where boys are supported, where they're marginalised, and then to adapt those relationships, environments, and practices to intentionally, continuously improve in their practice. The quadrant's embedded in the TBS research approach and has a really strong focus, a shift from that idea of fixing boys or pathologizing boys to changing the systems that are around it. So central to all aspects of the Taking Boys Seriously research process has been the boys themselves. And to keep it central, when we talk about the research, we like to bring the boys into the room. So for now, what I would like you to do is you don't get away without any participation at all in our research inputs. So for now, what I'd like you to do is to imagine a boy or a young man that you know. So somebody that maybe has been struggling with some aspects of life in school, or both outside of school, someone maybe that you work with already, maybe it's your son, maybe if you're a man, it's yourself, and you're thinking or reflecting on when you were a boy. And what we want you to do is give this boy a name and an age, and think about what are the things that may be going on for him? What may be the things that are getting in his way? Just take a little bit of time and think about that person, conjure them up, write it down for yourself, or you can put it into the chat so that we can see what boy that you're thinking about. And that's going to the purpose of doing that is that you've got that boy in your mind as we take you through our research. We'll be getting you to fill out a questionnaire as well from the perspective of that boy. So just take a bit of time, imagine a boy, someone you know, might be struggling, doesn't matter if they're big struggles or small ones, give him a pseudonym, what age is he, what do you know about him, what might he be struggling with, what might help him, and try and maybe introduce your boy in the chat so we get a sense of who you're thinking about. I'm going to give you a few minutes to do that. Sarah, now. Oh, you've done it. Nine now. Okay. So I'm assuming or hoping that you had enough time to do that. And what we're going to do now is move on to our baseline questionnaire. So this is the first quadrant in the boys and young men's quadrant. And don't worry if this isn't making entire sense to you yet. It will as we take you through the rest of the session. But what we want you to do with this now, there are 25 questions in total on this quadrant. The first 15 are about voice and influence and then interdependence. And the second 10 are about belonging and being a boy. And we speak to those more as we go through the research. But for now, what we want you to do, and it should only take you 3 to 4 minutes, is to go on via the QR code or the link that you see there in the chat and fill out the questionnaire. And you can submit that. It'll just come to Andy and myself as one of the training tools. So fill out your QR code from the perspective of the boy that you have just imagined, and submit that into us. And that will get you starting to think about some of the questions and the way that we've asked questions to boys and young men via the research. So we'll give you a few minutes to do that. Okay, everybody, thanks very much for doing that. I hope you got a chance to get that finished. It doesn't really matter whether you did finish it or not. It really is just to give you a bit of an idea of the types of things that we mean when we're talking about the Empowering Boys questionnaire and the questions and the reasons that we use them, and what we're trying to get at by doing that. So and we'll return to it, as I say, a bit as we work through the rest of the presentation for you this afternoon. So let me share a little bit with you, a little bit about the research and how we got to the quadrant. So what's the problem? Boys are doing less well than girls at all levels of education in relation to their outcomes. And that was the case in 2007 when the Department of Education first funded the Taking Boys Seriously research project. And it's also the case now, decades later. So it's a phenomenon that's repeated across many Western countries, and you may be familiar with it already. And I'm sure you will if you're working in education. And it impacts mostly on boys and young men from communities of relative poverty or working class communities. And it's a problem that's proven very difficult to shift. So what's going on for boys? And in some way, when I ask that question, sometimes what if we have more time, what I get is people to answer that question. What do they think it is? And I'm sure if we did ask that question of you, we get probably 22 different responses. Because what's going on for boys is really quite layered and pretty nuanced. There's lots of forces that are at play that are impacting on boys' capacity to succeed educationally. And quite often these are much deeper and more complex than simply the effort or the grit or the determination of a boy himself. I'm going to pass over to Andy, who's going to talk you through some of what we found were the things that got in the way for boys.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. We developed this term called compounded educational disadvantage to talk about what's going on for these boys and young men who often find themselves in the bottom rungs of the educational outcomes charts. And it's to try and move away from a focus on individual feelings as if it's the boys themselves that are the problem. Because there's this multi-generational cycle of boys from working class communities mainly, who are statistically least likely to have the same educational outcomes as their peers. And so we talk about compounded educational disadvantages, bricks in the backpack. Imagining those bricks are different structural barriers that once they're placed in a boy's backpack, they make it harder for them to proceed, progress through the system. And there's lots of different bricks that exist, but some that we heard very clearly when we were talking to boys and we were talking to youth workers and teachers and parents was firstly around poverty. And one youth worker put it quite nicely in saying that the young men that he was working with had to work twice as hard just to try and keep up with their more affluent peers. And so all the kind of implications of living in an area of deprivation and how that impacts on education. That's one of the bricks. And so in taking boys seriously, we're thinking about how do we remove those bricks? Another one was around masculinities and kind of normative or restrictive masculinities, some of the messages that boys and young men hear about themselves. And this is something that you can reflect on, and feel free to put some observations in the chat, just as I'm talking through this one. But if we think about the kind of messages that particularly working class boys and young men hear about themselves through the media, maybe through school, maybe through their community, maybe through employers, if you do a bit of a search of young men on Belfast Live or one of the news outlets, it tends to be, and we've done this time and time again, tends to be that you see negative stories rise to the surface. And so that's what we heard from the boys. And we were thinking about, well, how does our research, how does our educational approaches counter that? Do something that's a bit countercultural with these boys and young men. We developed this list for using ChatGPT, and on the left-hand side, we asked it to give some words to describe the kind of negative features of boys and young men. And on the right-hand side, the kind of stereotypical positive expectations placed upon boys and young men. And it gives a nice kind of visual of the tensions and contradictions that young men feel, where they, on one hand, have these expectations to be the things on the right hand side, to be powerful, to be strong, ambitious, and to be in control, commanding, assertive, and to not back down. And yet, on the other hand, when we have talked to boys in the research, they talk about how under the surface, behind the mask, they feel these other things. They feel um, that they're not in control, that they're not looking after their emotional and mental and physical health, and that some of these stereotypes that are negative, they've internalized. Young men talking about themselves in negative terms. And so that's part of the work with boys and young men, the context it's happening with. It's a brick in the backpack that isn't just these ideas come out of nowhere. They reflect social and cultural ideas about masculinity. And then the other kind of structural brick we found was approaches to education. And over time, as we developed thinking about relational education approaches, we were trying to kind of conceptualize how does that look different from what young men are telling us is the norm that isn't working for them, that's making them disengage from education. And this is a pretty basic kind of distinction between the two. You could kind of conceptualize education in lots of different ways. But it gives an overview of the dilemmas. So on the left-hand side, the instrumental approaches um, are things like being didactic, being taught to, emphasis on rote learning, of just memorization and repetition, of the emphasis being at the cognitive level and not engaging at the level of feelings and emotions. We're normalizing for boys and young men, talking about how they feel, of a prescribed curriculum rather than a more kind of improvised approach where whatever boys and young men bring into the room kind of gets integrated into the curriculum. Big emphasis on product and the final outcome of passing these high stakes exams at the end, rather than the process and the enjoyment of learning, of socializing young people, of education being about telling young people how to behave and how to be a good citizen, rather than getting them to think critically and igniting a passion within them, those things that they see as social justice issues and how they can actually influence and change and transform their communities, this place that they live in. And then an emphasis on objective approaches that don't take into account the realities of all the different learners. And so while on the one hand, we're not saying all the things on the left-hand side aren't important at all, of course, there's a time and a place for all of those. But what we found, what we've heard from the boys and from educators is that the pendulum has swung so far towards the instrumental that real intentional and purposive effort is required to move the pendulum more towards these relational approaches. And particularly, we heard that in kind of year 10, when boys are moving into starting to do GCSE courses, they might have been experiencing more of that relational stuff right through primary school into their first years of secondary education. And then suddenly the pendulum swings towards this instrumental. And that change is very difficult for them, and they're kind of going, what's going on here? And again, that's playing into this sense of disengagement in school.
Back to the perfect storm. Yeah. So the bricks in the backpack that come with these ideas of poverty, of social class, of contradictive masculinities, and inconsistent approaches for boys in education can result in what we call this perfect storm. and a process of self-elimination. So boys feel like it's them, it's their fault, they're not smart enough, they're not good enough. And in our research papers, we referred to this as a misrecognition of a series of factors over which they, the boys themselves, have little or no control. So as boys try to make sense of masculinities, as they feel the effects of poverty and their exclusion from opportunities that others get, they can express a whole range of behaviours, and you may have experienced some of these in your own classrooms or schools. And attitudes, things like compliance or defiance or passiveness or resistance, and in some cases a complete opt-out. In fact, that seems to be an increasing case at the minute, that they are opting out of attending school at all. So what do we do? In the TBS research, we adopted a participatory action research approach. We wanted to do research, as I said earlier, that would do something rather than say something. There's enough reports that state the problem, and arguably stating the constant restating of a problem itself can act to reinforce a problem. It can be counterproductive. So we wanted to do something that could potentially make a sustainable change for the boys. And what we did was we asked the real experts what worked in their experiences, and that's namely boys themselves, their teachers, their youth workers, leaders in education, and some parents as well. And to date, we have engaged with thousands of boys and hundreds of educators. We used this process that we called appreciative inquiry. And by that, what we did was we identified pockets of excellent practice to find out what they were doing that worked well for the boys and young men involved. And to negate that overuse of a deficit approach to young men, appreciative inquiry became a very important part of our research. In other words, we don't want to revisit problems, but to find out what's working. We want to change the narrative, to stop talking about male underachievement and problem boys and failing boys and problem males, and start to give boys and young men positive messages about themselves. So start talking about boys in positive ways as successes, not what about what's wrong, but about what's right with them and how we can embrace and support that. So for example, when we launched the research in 2018 at a conference, I asked the delegates to consider these three questions. What do I like about boys? What do I like about working with boys and young men? And what am I doing that's working well? Really very, very simple questions, but they're very effective. Even take a minute now and just maybe put a note down for yourself. What is it that you like about boys? What do you like about working with boys and young men? And what do you think that you're doing that is working well with boys and young men in particular? And we'll give you just a few minutes to reflect on that question. Mm. Okay. So hopefully you've had a bit of time to think about that and think about what you might say in relation to those questions. That's what we asked. So phase one of the research, we had 3 collaborative case study sites with schools and community-based projects in areas of multiple deprivation. So the participants, that's the boys, the teachers, the youth workers and senior leaders, explored aspects of education and learning that they found enriching and enjoyable and stimulating and memorable, and identified practices and processes and policies that they found to be beneficial. The initial findings from our earlier case studies then we collated into what you may already recognise as the 10 principles of relational education. So again and again, we heard that relationships matter, that trust and authentic communication comes first, and that became our principle 1, recognise the primacy of relationship. We also heard that every learner is a human being of inherent worth, and this becomes principle 2, demonstrating dignity and respect. We heard the importance of building on abilities and on strengths and not deficits. So this becomes principle 3, utilising a strength-based approach in education. We heard about emotional well-being, enabling learners to flourish, becomes principle 5, promoting mental health. We heard about how curiosity and exploration drive engagement. This becomes principle 9, enable creative learning environments, and so on it goes. You've got value the voice of boys, listen to them, learn from them, make way for the wisdom that they bring into learning environments. And these are not just nice to do or nice to have elements in education. These things are central to learning in itself. The approaches captured in those 10 TBS principles that you see in front of you offer a concrete, evidence-based framework that enable us to appreciate and enact relational education. And they're not abstract either. They align with many theoretical foundational thinkers like Paulo Freire, who talked about students as not empty vessels, dialogue and problem solving, or problem posing, activate understanding. John Dewey, who talked about knowledge arising from experience and engaging with learners' prior understanding. Carl Rogers, who emphasises the importance of trust and authentic human connection and learning, and Bell Hooks, who talks about teaching the whole person, not just the intellect, but also emotion, identity, and lived experiences. And that's just to name a few. For me, and I always say that the most striking aspect of the Taking Boys Seriously research process over almost 2 decades has been the consistent and persistent message from boys who are experts in their own lives, and educators, their parents, their teachers, and their youth workers who draw on their everyday experience that these are the things that are of inherent value. So we know what needs to be done. Humans inherently know how to support their own growth and learning, and as such, it supports that argument that education needs to be drawn back from that instrumental approach that Andy talked about earlier, from that practicality and productivity and instrumental aims, extrinsic objectives, and transactional standardized tests, more towards that connection, meaning personal growth as an end in itself, reflection and dialogue. Not so-called soft outcomes to be put into only classes that focus on personal and social development or interventions for those boys who are behaving badly, but a central defining principles, pedagogy and practice of education in itself. And in TBS, we've learned that relational education is more than simply just a method. It embodies this vision of education as transformative, as socially conscious and human-centred, and it reconnects us to the importance of enabling young people to grow as capable and confident, ethical and connected human beings. And the challenge we have now is, how do we embed these approaches more firmly at the heart of mainstream education? And I'm going to pass back to Andy.
Great.
So you've got a change of voice and a change of face for a minute.
Yeah, so I guess from the outset, looking at all the different challenges, the barriers, the dilemmas for boys and young men, it can seem overwhelming. It's a systemic issue that's multi-generational, that is repeated in many Western countries and other countries across the world. And we're seeing lots of reports coming out about the boy crisis, boys in crisis, and problems to do with how boys are engaging online, all of that. And so what can we do? What we found in our research was that taking an educational ecosystem approach helped to make it seem much more manageable. We have a really strong education infrastructure. We've got lots of excellent organizations embedded within communities, working alongside schools, that are making a difference. And it was listening to these leaders in communities and education, listening to the boys and hearing all these different ways that work, that then we start to talk about this educational ecosystem, and that everyone has a gift, everyone has something to contribute, everyone has a part to play. And what our research does is provide a shared language through the TBS principles, through a relational education approach, that everyone can get behind and implement and apply in their own setting in a way that makes sense. And what we tried to do was get local businesses to buy into this. So, Four Star Pizza, for instance, they sponsored one of our conferences, and they gave 20% off the boys and young men who wore their TBS pin badge. And it was a really nice way of them reflecting the same messages that boys and young men, through the research have heard, through the schools that are adopting this research, are hearing. And then in their community, in their local pizza shop, they go in, they can get discount on their pizza, but they also see the TBS principles reflected. So that's one small example. There's lots of different organizations, and there's more there. This is outdated now, this little image. There's many more people who have come on board. And we've since developed the Northern Ireland Boys Impact Hub, which is part of a Boys Impact movement right across the UK with 16 regional hubs, all using the Taking Boys Seriously principles to inform kind of collaborative, appreciative practice with boys and young men, bringing together schools with that wider educational ecosystem to bring about positive change for boys and young men. And the next development, I'll go past this, but has been where we started. We've ended here where we started, but it's taken us really 20 years to get to this point. And as you were filling in that questionnaire, you may have been thinking these are fairly basic questions to ask, but they're informed by the research, they're informed by the principles. And it's creating a framework to measure what matters to boys and young men in education. Because so much emphasis is put on attendance, attainment, and dealing with attrition rates, and those things are important. But what gets measured is what matters in education, because resources go towards it, and priorities are based around it. So what we're trying to do with the boys and young men's quadrant is to put these five areas of voice, influence, interdependence, belonging, and being a boy at the heart of a holistic education approach with boys and young men. And drawing on from the research, so there's intentional practice resources related to the baseline measure in those 5 areas. There's collaborative inquiry resources to support educators who can come together and reflect on what they're already doing well, do some of that appreciative inquiry work, and involve the boys in it. And then doing that measure again to see how things changed. We tested the Empowering Boys questionnaire out with 1,168 young men under the things. And I'm not going to go through all the data at the minute, but I'll go through a couple of slides on the being a boy, because it stands out as quite interesting. So we asked boys, do you feel proud to be a boy or a young man? This was overwhelmingly positive and stood out compared to lots of other of the responses. And it's interesting because it tells you something, but it asks a lot more questions. Well, what does that mean? What do boys think about being proud? Why would they say that? What about the 2% who said no, or the 4% who said not really? What's going on for those boys? And these questions become a launchpad for conversations with young men around masculinities. And the responses were quite varied in relation to this question. Do you get positive messages about yourself as a boy or young man in school? 16% saying not really, and 10% saying no. So that's a quarter of boys who feel like they're not getting positive messages. And by engaging in this process, by putting the quadrant into practice, what we found is educational settings are becoming more intentional about these and being purposeful about giving positive messages to boys and young men. This one, as you might expect, can you only express your feelings or emotions as a boy or young man? A lot of young men maybe saying sometimes, and a lot not really, and no. So that idea of kind of emotional fluency, it still needs work with young men. And finally, this one, in the context of all the wider kind of social, kind of political ideas about masculinities and what's expected of men and those contradictions that young men are experiencing, we asked boys, do you get to talk about being a young man in school? And a lot of them, again, saying not really or no. And so part of what we're doing with the research is encouraging those conversations, but doing it through the lens of the appreciative inquiry approach and as part of a relational education, holistic approach to education and learning. Susan, you want to add anything before this?
Yeah, maybe just to finish off, just to say, I mean, what we have just done is taken you on an extreme an extreme speed tour through some of the main findings and some of the main evidence and some of the tools of our research, and hopefully that you have been able to take something away from that. I think if there were three main messages that we would give you, that is, our research points to the need for relational approaches in education, and our principles underpin those relational approaches, and being central to be able to do anything that's going to enable boys to thrive well in their educational settings. The second thing is that we talk about empowering boys. So empowering boys, the boys quadrant, the boys and young men's quadrant, is really a tool that we think is useful in relation to doing empowering practices with boys, because it enables boys to have their say, it builds their agency, it builds their autonomy, and it builds an appreciation of them as young people and boys. And the third thing that we would say that is important is that we have to engage with critical masculinity. So we have got to talk to boys about what it's like to be a boy, and about masculinity, and about some of the things that some of the contradictions in masculinity, and help them understand, as they develop their own identity, how those things impact on their experiences. Because as we know, if we're not talking to them, they're getting that information elsewhere anyway. So making sure that we talk to boys about masculinities. There's so much going on in the world that they're navigating from, like we all are, geopolitical instability, democratic backsliding, information disorder, social media, creating more misinformation, technological advances. And working relationally with boys and young men gives them a really good chance. It gives us all a good chance, to support and ease their journey and purpose beyond life, and beyond school for their life. So maybe the final three questions. What are we like for time? Yeah, so that's us finishing off. What we'd like you to reflect on is maybe how does the TBS research, or what you know of it, connect to your own experience? What has that last hour made you think about, and is there any way that might be useful in your own practice? Yeah, over to you, Tiernan, if you want to.
Yeah. So, I mean, just on reflecting on that, first of all, I want to say thank you to both of you for a brilliant presentation. I think it does connect deeply to what not only teachers in general are interested in, but also integrated skills specifically. And I think it says the number of people who wanted to attend the session speaks to that. And it made me think about what we talk about in anti-bias, to be honest, where we do talk about, celebrating identity and being aware of your own identity in so many different ways. But maybe something gets lost is, in talking to boys, being a boy, being a young man is integral to their identity, but it's not something maybe we actively think about enough. And it made me think about, I think, I forget which one of you it was. I think it was Andy, when you said that, restating a problem that can reinforce a problem, and focusing on the problem isn't always advantageous, whereas actually giving opportunities for boys to talk about empowerment and the positive aspects of what it means to be a boy is so important. So I certainly got a lot from that, and I hope everyone else did as well. I suppose what I would ask is that when we're getting back in touch with you, I'll send through a link to the video, and I'll also gather some of the links that you've shared. So there's the boy quadrant, and then is there a link to that? You said the Northern Ireland Boys Impact Hub. Is that an actual page that can be linked, or is that something I could share?
It's a collective, it's a network of people. So if anyone
Okay.
wants to join that, you're very welcome. We have teachers and youth workers and policymakers, university lecturers will try and bring together that ecosystem of trying to replicate that through the Boys Impact Hub, and anyone is welcome to come and join us at that, so we can send out details through you, Tiernan, for the next meeting.
Brilliant.
There's a number of things that people can do if they're interested in getting involved, and one of them is getting involved in the Voice Impact Hub. As Andy says, that's our way of trying to replicate that ecosystem and make sure that we're all driving from the same place, and that we're working collaboratively and collectively to try and make some difference. What they're in relation to the research and the impact part of the research, we are interested in anybody who wants to maybe take the quadrant on and use it in schools. Some people do that as a whole school approach. Some do it as a collaborative approach with maybe youth services in their local communities, and some people do it with just specific groups of young people in different educational contexts. But what we're interested in is if anybody is interested in trying to put something into practice, we'd work alongside and try and collect data and look at how that impacts, and we would ask schools maybe to give us the data that they collect from that, so we can see what difference that's making, just to continue on the process of trying to embed something in practice. If anyone's interested in that, they can do that and get in touch with either Andy or myself if that's
Brilliant.
the case.
That sounds
Is there
great.
anything else? And of course, we've got the website. So we've got the TBS website where everything is. If anybody just wants to dip in and have a look, and we've got publications there as well. If anybody wants to read more depth to what we've just managed to say in about 45 minutes about what a 10-year research has come up with. There's a lot more to it. So if anybody's really interested in deep diving into that, they can find that online.
Fantastic. So yeah, I'll be in touch with everyone by email soon. I'll get in touch with you two first just to gather a few of those links. I've muted myself somehow. But yeah, I was just saying I'll be in touch, and I'll get in touch with you two first just to gather some of the links and information to share alongside the video. We've gotten lots of lovely comments there from different people just saying thank you for the session, and really positive feedback about the session. So again, thank you very much for coming along. We appreciate you speaking to us, and thank you to everyone for being here. I know it's not easy to give your time too much really when you're so busy, but I hope it was useful for everyone. So have a lovely evening, and speak to you soon, hopefully.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.